Okay, we are going to give a flipped lesson a try while I'm gone for my training today. So bear with me because I have never done this before, and I am certainly not going to be doing this a lot because I like to do live lessons, but just so that I can take the pressure off of the substitute and continue on with our grammar lessons, we're going to try to do this commas slideshow together. And then during periods 6 and 7, if I have not returned, you guys will be working on some Starbucks time, and you're going to focus your energy on your one-pagers, TDAs, AR, anything really that is due for me, but you should really be focusing your energy on those upcoming due dates that have like sort of larger grades like your TDA and your one-pager. Okay, let's get started. Commas in compound sentences and series. Series is a fancy name for a list. Our first rule, number 1, no comma confetti. You should not just be throwing commas into your writing wherever you think they may fit. You should really be thinking about where you are naturally pausing as you speak and what kinds of words you are looking for, like conjunctions or whether or not you are actually speaking in a series or a list. That is when you should be adding commas, not whenever you feel it necessary. A comma is a punctuation mark that signals a separation between ideas or a slight pause. In the following slides, we will discuss the times that you should use a comma. You should not throw commas around your writing like confetti. I cannot say this enough. Use a comma before and, or, nor, but, for, so, and yet to join independent clauses in a compound sentence. For example, discarded corn cobs are a waste, but one day they may be a source of fuel. Also, another example, gasoline is expensive and prices are rising. These places that I am pointing to, so discarded corn cobs are a waste and one day they may be a source of fuel, those are considered independent clauses. When we combine them using the word but, we have to use a comma in between. All right, the same thing goes with this second sentence here. Gasoline is expensive and prices are rising are two independent clauses. So when we put them together, we have to include a comma before our word and. Sorry. Use a comma to separate words in a series of 3 or more items. Place a comma after every item except for the last one. So this is when we are making lists, and lists are considered 3 or more items. So our first example says companies must develop a way to harvest, store, and transport corn cobs. And our second example says corn oil, sweeteners, or feed for livestock may also be produced by ethanol plants. So in both of our sentences, we have a series or list of things. The first one is harvest, store, and transport corn cobs. All 3 of these things are what companies must develop to transport them. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, we put a comma in between all of them except for after the last one. And our second example, corn oil, sweeteners, or feed are our 3 items in our series. So we're going to put a comma in between all of those, but not after the last one. Okay, so once again, use a comma to separate words in a series of 3 or more items. Place a comma after every item except for that last one. Our next slide says, use a comma to separate 2 or more adjectives that come before and modify the same noun. If it makes sense to use and between 2 adjectives, use a comma. Our first example says, gasoline is a liquid, colorless fuel. So you want to put your comma in between liquid and colorless because both of these adjectives are describing the fuel. Another example is she was a kind, intelligent student. Okay, so both of these adjectives, kind and intelligent, they both describe the student, but we are putting a comma here instead of the word and. Okay, so where we could say, gasoline is a liquid and colorless fuel, we simply replace that with a comma here, and we do the same thing in this sentence. She was a kind and intelligent student. We just replace that and with a comma. Do not use a comma if the first adjective modifies the second adjective. For example, the future may bring a new electric car, not new and electric. Therefore, we do not need a comma in between here, okay? And I do know this is a typo right here. It's supposed to say if. Okay, so I have a little chart here that sort of outlines some of your rules for comma usage. So our first one is about introductory words, phrases, or clauses. Our rule is to use a comma to set off a word or group that introduces a sentence. For example, for Little League pitchers, rules limit the number of pitches in a game. All right, our introductory phrase is for Little League pitchers, so we have to use a comma here to set it off from the rest of the sentence. Interrupters, parenthetical expressions. The rule is use a comma to set off additional information that isn't necessary. Another example, it is stressful, in fact, to play any sport year-round. Okay, so this little part here, this in fact, doesn't have to be in the sentence. And because it's sort of an optional phrase to add, you can actually set it off with commas, okay, because the sentence would make sense without it. It is stressful to play any sport year-round. Makes just as much sense as adding this in fact in the middle. So we sort of set that off by putting commas in there. And if you were to say this sentence naturally to yourself, you would pause there briefly. And that's sort of how you remember to add a comma there. A direct address. The rule for a direct address is to use a comma to set apart the noun that names a person being addressed. So our example here says, please explain, Dr. Andrews, why young athletes face unusual risk. Again, just like our example up here having to do with in fact, just because they address him here doesn't mean they absolutely have to. If we took Dr. Andrews out of this sentence, it would make just as much sense. For example, please explain why young athletes face unusual risk. Dr. Andrews is optional in there, which is why it is set off by these commas. So for this direct address, you can just put comma before and comma after Dr. Andrews. We could do this for our students as well. Please explain, Peyton, why you have forgotten your AR book. Just kidding. All right, for our next one, it says non-essential clauses. Rule, use a comma to set off a subordinate clause that adds extra non-essential information to a sentence. Once again, we're talking about non-essential extra information. So our example here says, sports injuries, which are common, sideline many young athletes. All right, just like we talked about before, if you removed what is in between these commas, it would make just as much sense. Sports injuries sideline many young athletes. So that unnecessary information is set off with a comma before it and a comma after it to sort of denote that it is optional. Non-essential appositive words and phrases. Our rule, appositives rename a noun. Set them apart with commas if they add extra information. So it says, Mike Mussina, a Yankees pitcher, has served on the Little League Board of Directors. So again, you do not need to include a Yankees pitcher in this sentence. It is optional. So we set it off with a comma before and a comma after because Mike Mussina has served on the Little League Board of Directors makes just as much sense. It is just not as specific as naming him as a Yankees pitcher. So once again, this optional information here is put in between commas. Date and year. This is definitely something that is more useful to you on a day-to-day basis. So the rule is use a comma to separate the date and year and after the year if the date is in the middle of a sentence, okay? So our example here says the first Little League game was played on June 6th, 1939 in Pennsylvania. If you are just writing the date like I do on the board every day, you only need this comma in between the day and the year. Okay, but if it appears in the middle of a sentence, you would also include a comma after the year and then continue on with the rest of your sentence. Okay, direct quotations, which we have been talking about a lot since we are discussing TDAs. All right, the rule is to use a comma to separate a direct quote from the rest of the sentence. Our example says, Mike Mussina, a fan said, is one of the all-time greats. All right, so we have a comma here and a comma here. All right, because this is all happening in one sentence and in the middle is where we are separating. This is what we're using to separate the quote. We have to have a comma here because the sentence isn't over and a comma here. Okay, because once again, this is optional in the middle. You don't need to have a fan said. Mike Mussina is one of the all-time greats. Makes just as much sense without that sort of separation in the middle. Okay, let's move on.